This is green. These are various shades of green. This is all the information about green. Now show green to a person who is blind since birth. And I mean show, not explain. What will you do? Tell him the frequency of green? How green feels like to people? What things are green? No matter how hard you try to explain, you will not be able to help him visualize the color green. Why? Because his brain has never learned to process color. His brain is different compared to a sighted person with a completely different history. People with different mental conditions have different brains due to biological and/or circumstantial reasons. Take schizophrenia for example. You may be able to list all the things that people with schizophrenia experience and know the neuroscience behind it and try to construct the reality a schizophrenic person experiences, but you will never be able to experience their reality yourself. You will never be able to truly know how schizophrenia feels like until you have it. Along with the inability to experience someone's mental state, another major problem with mental illness is that most of the suffering the person endures is internal. A person with depression can smile and go on with daily life, and you might never know the complete intensity of that person's suffering. Even if that person tries to open up, you might still not be able to realize the intensity as the person is not telling you each and every moment he or she is suffering. As a result, other people are not observing the whole suffering of the patient but a limited version of it. Here we have established two things. The brain of the person suffering from mental illness is quite different, and we are not observing the full extent of their suffering. Before we go any further, let's talk about empathy. Empathy is a simulation. Sounds pretty weird, huh?
And I like to focus on a system of neurons called mirror neurons in the front of the brain. These neurons are called motor command neurons. They're a subcategory of motor command neurons. Motor command neurons are involved in orchestrating a sequence of muscle twitches to reach out and grab a cup. So there's one neuron or a small group of neurons in the frontal lobes, in the premotor cortex, that fires away when I reach out and grab a cup, orchestrating the sequence of muscle twitches. But it turns out that a small set of these neurons, identified in the last 10 years, will fire not only when I reach and grab a cup, but when I watch you reach out and grab a cup. This sounds astonishing, it sounds psychic, but it isn't. These neurons are called mirror neurons. So what's a mirror neuron doing? When I saw this paper, I jumped off my seat, because it's what the neuron is signaling to the higher areas in the brain is, the higher areas are saying, the same neuron is firing now as would fire when you reach and grab a cup. Therefore, that's what that person is intending to do. So it's a mind-reading neuron. It's a neuron that's creating a virtual reality simulation of another person's mind and empathizing with the other person, so to speak, which is the basis of compassion after all. So it allows you to look at the world from the other person's point of view.
So we have learned that brains take input from other people and then simulate the same input in our brain, and that leads to empathy. But here, in the case of mental illness, both of these factors are an issue. Let's say you have two people in front of you. One who is suffering from depression and another who has a huge cut in their leg. For the one with the cut, you are getting 100% visual input, and also your brain knows what physical pain is and how to process that pain. So even if you have never had that big cut yourself, your brain will still be able to simulate the extent of suffering of that person. However, for a depressed person, there is very minimal visual input, and if you are someone who has never had a major depressive disorder, then your brain will be unable to simulate that suffering, and as a result, the person with mental illness gets alone in terms of their experience. What happens is, we judge the situation of the depressed individual from our state of mind, which greatly undermines the intensity of their problem. Yeah, so you're depressed? Go and have a walk in the park, you'll be alright. The issue gets reduced to simply feeling low or sadness. Similarly, ADHD gets reduced to someone who is just distracted because he is not trying to focus. OCD gets reduced to someone who just washes hands a lot. Bipolar gets reduced to someone who's just very moody. Anxiety disorders to someone who's just nervous or shy. Because a person who doesn't have those issues is simulating them according to their own mind, when in fact the difference of mind is the issue. This ultimately leads to the lack of empathy and compassion towards the people suffering with mental illness, when in fact it's something they need the most. So what can we do? Well, to begin with, we can believe them. We have to accept that if a person is diagnosed, then they are experiencing something which might be beyond our capability to comprehend, and that there's evidence for it. We can acknowledge that our chances of facing a car accident or breaking our leg ain't far from our chances of having a biological component or going through traumatic experiences that can make us susceptible to falling in a mental health crisis. According to statistics, every 1 in 5 individuals is likely to suffer from mental illness of varying severity in their lifetime, and thus we might as well be in their place someday. We can stop making them feel that their pain and suffering does not make sense, that it's invalid, small, or unjustified. We can stop telling them that they are just not trying hard enough, that they're weak or inferior. Maybe it's time that we address our differences and accept that there are things that we know but don't understand. Maybe it's time that we stop advising and start listening to them. Maybe it's time that we shatter those walls of stigma by educating ourselves and by spreading awareness. Instead of abandoning them, judging them, and shutting them out, we can give them the love, support, empathy, and compassion that they need the most. And amidst this global pandemic, when we are all locked up in our homes, we need to do this now more than ever. At last, it's time to acknowledge that we have been blinded to their suffering for long. And though we can't see the color green as they do, we now know enough to accept that it exists.